An Israeli tank reservist sits wrapped in prayer, his nation's armored shield resting not in its barracks but in the quiet of his own home. It is Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973, and the radios across Israel are silent in observance of the holiest day of the year. That silence, a symbol of devotion, is about to become the single greatest vulnerability his country has ever known. The streets of Jerusalem are empty. On this day, the Day of Atonement, a profound stillness settles over the nation. Cars do not move, shops are shuttered. The air, usually filled with the sounds of a bustling city, is quiet enough to hear the wind moving through the cypress trees. All across the country, radios are switched off, their silence a mark of respect and introspection. It is a day for fasting, for prayer, for family. It is a day when the nation turns inward, away from the world and its troubles. In a small apartment, a young reservist sits with his family, a prayer shawl draped over his shoulders. He is a tanker, a crewman for one of the rugged Sho't Kal tanks that form the backbone of the Israeli Armored Corps. But today his uniform is packed away. His tank sits cold in a depot miles from the border. His duty is not to a machine of war, but to a tradition stretching back thousands of years. Far in the distance, a faint siren wails for a moment, a thin, lonely sound that is quickly swallowed by the quiet. He dismisses it. A malfunction, perhaps. On Yom Kippur, the world is supposed to be at peace. Miles to the northeast, in a concrete command bunker deep beneath Damascus, the world is anything but peaceful. Here, the atmosphere is the complete opposite, tense, loud and thick with cigarette smoke. Maps are spread across massive tables, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. Syrian officers, their faces flushed with anticipation, argue in loud voices, pointing with grease pencils to break through routes and artillery grids. This is the nerve center of an army coiled to strike. In the corner of the room, a group of Soviet military advisors watches the scene with a quiet, professional detachment. Among them is Colonel Volkov of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. He is not here to participate in the shouting. He is here to observe, to analyze, to ensure that the magnificent machine of Soviet hardware and doctrine performs as designed. In his hands, he holds a sheaf of the latest intelligence reports, summaries of signals, intercepts, and satellite reconnaissance. The words on the page confirm what the Syrians have been hoping for, what their entire plan is built upon. The Israeli reserves have not been mobilized. Israeli military communications are almost completely silent, adhering to the strictures of the holy day. Volkov's own analysts estimate that 70% of the nation's reserve armor is still parked in depots, its crews at home, fasting and praying like the young man in Jerusalem. The reports on the Golan Heights are even more stark. The border, a strategic plateau of volcanic rock overlooking northern Israel, is dangerously thin. A skeleton force holds the line, a tripwire that is about to be hit by a sledgehammer. Volkov looks from the reports to the map. The Syrians have done their work well. They have concentrated 5 full divisions for the assault, a force of nearly 60,000 men. 3 of those divisions are armored, equipped with hundreds of late-model Soviet tanks, mostly T-55s and the newer, more powerful T-62s. It is a sea of steel, a mailed fist, poised to shatter the thin Israeli defenses and pour down into the Galilee. To Volkov, a man who trusts numbers and the cold arithmetic of war, the outcome seems a foregone conclusion. The odds are overwhelming, almost mathematically perfect. The Israelis are asleep spiritually and militarily. The Syrians are awake, armed, and ready. The silence that has descended over Israel is not a sign of peace to him. It is a signal of profound vulnerability, a gap in the armor of a nation that prides itself on its vigilance. He watches the Syrian generals finalizing their plans, their confidence bordering on arrogance, and he makes a quiet note. All variables are accounted for. The element of surprise is absolute. The storm is about to break, and the world, in its Yom Kippur slumber, has no idea it is coming. As the afternoon wears on, the calculated tension in the Damascus bunker is about to be unleashed. The plan, so meticulously reviewed by Colonel Volkov and his Syrian counterparts, is set in motion. The numbers are on their side, surprise is absolute, and the iron fist of Soviet doctrine is about to descend upon the Golan Heights. At precisely 14 hours, the silence of Yom Kippur is not broken. It is annihilated. A single, continuous roar erupts along the 70-mile front. From hidden positions, hundreds of Syrian artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. Tens of thousands of shells scream across the border, turning the rocky basalt plateau of the Golan into a boiling dust cloud. The ground itself, formed from ancient lava flows, shatters under the bombardment, pulverizing the black volcanic rock into a fine, abrasive dust as fine as flour. This unique basalt dust, sharp and metallic, hangs in the air, creating a hellish curtain of smoke, steel, and pulverized earth. In the chaos of the moment, no one could possibly know that this very dust, kicked up by their own guns, contains a hidden property that will ironically magnify the infrared scatter of their own equipment, turning every one of their tanks into a glowing target in the night to come. Through this man-made storm, the main assault begins. An iron tide of 1,400 Syrian tanks lurches forward, their diesel engines roaring in a deafening chorus. They advance in 3 massive, coordinated thrusts, a masterpiece of Soviet operational art. On the northern axis, the elite 7th Armored Division, equipped with the best Soviet T-62 tanks, pushes toward the high ground. In the center, a mixed force of T-55s and T-62s drives a wedge into the heart of the Israeli defenses. To the south, another armored column advances with the strategic objective of capturing the vital command hub at Naffa. For the handful of Israeli defenders, it is an apocalypse. They are outnumbered more than 10 to 1. From their defensive positions, they see a sea of steel emerging from the dust, a seemingly endless wave of Soviet armor rolling towards them. In the Damascus bunker, Colonel Volkov watches the reports come in, a quiet sense of professional satisfaction on his face. This is the doctrine of deep battle in action. Overwhelming force applied at a single point to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The first test is the Israeli minefields, a dense network of anti-tank mines designed to slow any assault. The Syrians, using Soviet-made mine-clearing line charges and heavy plows, breach these obstacles with a speed that surprises even Volkov. The Israeli defenses, meant to be a stubborn series of obstacles, are simply overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the Syrian advance. The reports of the successful breaches are met with cheers in the Syrian command bunker. The tension of the morning evaporates, replaced by a jubilant, almost giddy confidence. A Syrian general, his face beaming, pops the cork on a bottle of champagne, the sound lost in the roar of celebratory shouts. Volkov does not partake in the celebration, but he allows himself a small, satisfied nod. The plan is working not just as intended, but better than expected. The numbers, the timing, the execution, it is all proceeding with the beautiful, brutal logic of a mathematical equation. The Israeli line is shattered. The road to the Jordan River and the Galilee beyond seems to be wide open. In these first few hours of the war, as Syrian tanks pour through the gaps in the Israeli defenses, there is no reason for anyone in the Damascus bunker to believe that this will be anything other than a swift and glorious victory. The hardware is performing flawlessly, the doctrine is proving itself sound, and the enemy is in full retreat. The confidence is absolute, but darkness is falling fast over the Golan, and with it comes a new set of rules for which Soviet doctrine has no answer. As dusk settles, the initial Syrian euphoria begins to face its first real test. Darkness drops with a sudden finality over the Golan Heights. The setting sun is swallowed by the thick clouds of smoke and basalt dust, plunging the battlefield into an almost total blackness. A cold wind sweeps down from the snow-capped peaks of Mount Hermon, carrying with it a chilling sense of uncertainty. For the Syrian tank crews, this is the moment their technological superiority is supposed to shine. Inside the cramped, sweltering turret of a T-62, a gunner switches on his active infrared night vision system. A massive IR searchlight mounted to the turret hums to life, projecting a powerful, invisible beam into the darkness. Through his sight, the world is transformed into a shimmering, ghostly green landscape. But the advantage is not as clear as the manuals promised. The temperature inside the steel hull, after hours of combat under the hot sun, is soaring past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The loader, already exhausted from manually ramming heavy 115mm shells into the breech, slumps against the turret wall, his uniform soaked with sweat. Across the front, hundreds of Syrian tanks follow suit, their IR searchlights cutting invisible swaths through the night. The plan is to continue the advance, to press their advantage, and not allow the Israelis a moment to regroup. But as they push forward into the darkness, the radio networks begin to fill with confusion and panic. Colonel Volkov, monitoring the situation from Damascus, listens to the translated radio intercepts with a growing sense of unease. The clean, confident reports of the afternoon are gone, replaced by a cacophony of static and fear. "North 17 to North 6, a panicked voice crackles over the speaker. "I see your IR beam, but I cannot acquire enemy silhouettes. The dust is too thick. Request guidance." A burst of static follows, then shouting, "North 6 is hit, taking fire from the dark. We are taking fire from the dark." In the bunker, a Soviet signals technician, an expert in night vision technology, mutters to his colleague, "This is impossible. They cannot be shooting accurately at 3 kilometers in pitch black. The Israelis don't have FLIR. Their older tanks have no starlight optics. They should be blind, but the Israelis are not blind. They are using a simple, brutal tactic that exploits a fatal flaw in the Soviet technology. The air over the Golan is thick with the fine, pulverized basalt dust from the day's artillery bombardment. This dust is highly reflective. When a Syrian T-62 turns on its powerful infrared searchlight, the invisible beam hits this wall of dust and scatters, creating a massive, diffuse bloom of IR light. To the Syrian gunner, it's like driving into a thick fog with your high beams on. The light just reflects back, blinding him. But to the Israeli tankers, hidden in hull-down positions with their engines off and their own lights cold, the battlefield looks entirely different. They don't need to see the Syrian tanks themselves. They simply see dozens of huge glowing beacons, the IR searchlights, moving through the darkness. The Israelis are not aiming at tanks, they are aiming at the sources of light. They fire directly into the center of the shimmering IR blooms. Volkov listens to report after report of Syrian tanks being hit by an unseen enemy. A horrifying realization begins to dawn on him. The very technology that was supposed to give his allies an advantage at night has become their greatest liability. Each tank, in its attempt to see, is actively announcing its precise location to a hidden enemy. He scribbles a frantic note on his pad, a piece of battlefield wisdom learned at a terrible price. He underlines the words twice. Active IR in dusty terrain, taking suicide. The phantom tanks that are slaughtering the Syrian advance are not phantoms at all. They are simply hunters, lying in wait, watching their prey light themselves up in the dark. As the night wears on, a second, even more fundamental flaw in Soviet tank design reveals itself. one that has nothing to do with advanced electronics and everything to do with simple geometry. The Syrian commanders trained on the flat plains of Eastern Europe had assumed the Golan Heights was a relatively level plateau. They are disastrously wrong. The Golan is not flat. It is a brutal, unforgiving landscape carved by ancient lava flows into a chaotic series of horse saddle ridges, sudden drop-offs, wadis, and jagged basalt shelves. It is a tank commander's nightmare, a landscape that offers a defender an almost infinite number of places to hide. The Israelis, having held this ground for years, know its every contour. They are not fighting a linear battle, they are using the terrain itself as a weapon. The classic Israeli tactic of the hull-down position becomes lethally effective here. A Syrian tank column advancing confidently through what appears to be a flat valley or wadi is suddenly ambushed. An Israeli Sho't Kal turret pops up from behind a ridge, its long gun already aimed. It fires a single, devastating shot and then immediately drops back down into cover before the Syrians can react. This tactic is made possible by a crucial and overlooked difference in engineering philosophy. The Israeli Sho't Kal, an upgraded British Centurion tank, was designed with a gun that has a depression angle of 10 degrees. This means the gunner can aim significantly downward, allowing the tank to hide its entire hull behind a ridge and still fire on targets below it. The Soviet T-62, by contrast, was designed for the vast open plains of a European war. Its designers prioritized a low silhouette above all else. To achieve this, they crammed the crew into a tight, compact hull, which severely restricted the movement of the massive gun breech. As a result, the T-62's main gun has a maximum depression of only around 4 degrees. It cannot effectively shoot downward. This single, seemingly minor technical detail has catastrophic consequences on the Golan. When a T-62 reaches the edge of a ridge to fire on an Israeli tank in a wadi below, it must expose almost its entire hull to get the gun low enough to aim. It becomes a massive, vulnerable target. Conversely, when an Israeli Sho't Kal is in a hull-down position, the Syrian tanks on the high ground above it literally cannot depress their guns far enough to hit it. In the Damascus command bunker, the radio traffic is a litany of frustration and rage. "They rise, they fire, and then they vanish," a Syrian brigadier screams over the network, his voice tight with fury after losing half his company in minutes. "We cannot traverse our guns in time. We cannot see them until it is too late." He slams his helmet against the turret wall in a fit of impotent rage. Colonel Volkov listens, the cold reality settling in. His nation had built a tank for a perfect theoretical war on a flat battlefield. The Israelis were fighting with an older, supposedly inferior tank that was perfectly adapted to the brutal, imperfect reality of the terrain they were defending. The Syrians are not just being outfought, they are being outthought. The battlefield is not a chessboard, it is a landscape, and the Israelis are using its geometry as a silent, unkillable ally. The phantom tanks are not just phantoms because they are hidden by darkness, they are phantoms because the very shape of the earth is fighting on their side. The Syrian advance, which began with such overwhelming confidence, is now grinding to a bloody halt. The psychological toll of fighting an enemy who is invisible, who cannot be hit, and who uses the very ground as a weapon, begins to cause a catastrophic collapse in morale. This is not just fear, it is a deeper, more technical trauma, a dawning realization that the machines they were told were invincible are fundamentally flawed. A Syrian T-62, part of a desperate frontal assault, is struck in its thickest frontal armor, but the impact is not what the crew expects. There is no massive explosion of a heat round. Instead, the crew hears a sharp, violent crack, like a giant steel whip striking the hull. The APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot round, a solid dart of tungsten, passes through the entire hull of the tank like a sewing needle through cloth, leaving two perfect fist-sized holes, one at the front, one at the back. It pierces the engine block and the tank rolls to a silent, smoking stop. When Soviet advisors later inspect this wreck, they will immediately recognize the signature of a kinetic energy penetrator. Their own best ammunition is a heat round. This tungsten dart is evidence of a different, and perhaps superior, anti-armor philosophy, one that relies on pure, brutal velocity rather than a chemical explosion. For the Syrian crew, the effect is terrifying. Their armor, their shield, has been rendered as useless as wet paper. This technological shock is compounded by a simple human factor, exhaustion. Inside the cramped turret of the T-62, the loader is a prisoner of bad design. To load the massive 115mm shell, he must contort his body in the tight space, grabbing a heavy round, ramming it into the breech, and then waiting for the breech to cycle. A fresh, motivated crew can achieve a rate of fire of perhaps 6 rounds per minute. But after hours of combat, choked by propellant fumes in a 120-degree steel box, that rate of fire plummets. It drops to 2 rounds per minute, then 1. Exhaustion crushes their will to fight. In stark contrast, the Israeli Sho't Kal was designed with crew endurance in mind. The turret is spacious. The loader can stand fully upright on a flat, uncluttered floor. He can move with a smooth, practiced rhythm, pulling a shell from a ready rack and loading it in a single, efficient motion. Even under the immense stress of combat, an Israeli crew can maintain a consistent rate of fire of 8 to 10 rounds per minute, reloading in as little as 6 to 8 seconds. This means that for every one shot a tired Syrian crew can get off, the Israelis can fire 2 or even 3. The battlefield becomes a horribly lopsided duel where the Syrian tanks are not only blind, but are also being systematically outpaced in their ability to return fire. This resilience is not just mechanical, it is deeply cultural. For the Israeli crews, the Sho't Kal is not just a machine, it is seen as the tank of the stubborn, the last line of the nation. They are not fighting on foreign soil, they are fighting on the very edge of their homes. This sense of existential purpose gives them a resolve that the Syrian attackers, fighting for a political objective, simply cannot match. They will not retreat. They will hold their ground, their older, slower tanks becoming immovable fortresses of sheer willpower. The psychological collapse of the Syrian units is the inevitable result. They are being killed by an enemy they cannot see from positions they cannot hit, by a weapon that their armor cannot stop, and at a rate they cannot possibly match. It is a formula for absolute despair. As the Syrian armored columns bog down in a nightmare of pop-up attacks and unseen killers, their advance in the southern Golan converges on a critical crossroads. This is the moment where, by all rights, the Israeli line should have broken completely. The few surviving Israeli tanks are scattered low on ammunition, their crews nearing total exhaustion. It is here, in the darkest hours of the night of October the 6th, that a legend is born in real time, a legend that will perfectly encapsulate the failure of the rigid, numbers-based Soviet doctrine. A young Israeli lieutenant, Zvika Greengold, his own tank damaged, arrives at the Nafa command post to find it in chaos. He takes command of the first operational Sho't Kal he can find. Over the next 20 hours, he will fight a lonely, desperate battle, racing from one sector to another, plugging gaps in the crumbling Israeli line. He gathers a handful of surviving tanks from multiple battered units, a ragtag collection of 2, sometimes 3, operational vehicles. He gives this tiny ad hoc unit a name, the Zvika Force. In reality, for most of that long, terrifying night, Zvika fights almost entirely alone. his force, often consisting of just his single operational tank. He uses the darkness and the chaotic terrain to his advantage, creating the illusion of a much larger formation. He fires a few shots from one ridge, then quickly repositions to another, firing again from a different direction. He uses the radio with cunning, calling out orders to non-existent units, reporting the movements of a phantom Israeli company to create confusion and hesitation in the Syrian ranks. In the Damascus bunker, Soviet signals intelligence analysts are monitoring the Israeli radio frequencies. They listen to the transmissions from the Zvika force, and what they hear baffles them. On the one hand, they intercept multiple, distinct Israeli voices, calmly coordinating their fire, calling out targets, and reporting their positions. It sounds like a well-organized, company-sized unit conducting a disciplined defense. But the acoustic sensors and other intelligence sources tell a different story. In the sector where the Zvika force is supposedly operating, the analysts can only detect the sound signature of a single, maybe two, tank engines. The data is contradictory. The radio chatter suggests a full company of at least 10 tanks. The physical evidence suggests there is almost nothing there. Colonel Volkov studies the transcripts, a sense of dawning, grudging respect on his face. He sees what is happening. The Israelis are not just fighting, they are performing. They are using the radio as a tool of psychological warfare, simulating a full armored company to deceive the Syrian commanders and sow paralysis. This is a tactic that does not appear in any Soviet military textbook. It is a brilliant, desperate act of improvisation. "They are simulating a full company," Volkov mutters to a subordinate, pointing at the conflicting reports. Now, this is not mathematics. This is not a calculation of force ratios or armor thickness. He pauses, searching for the right word. This is human ingenuity. It is a profound admission. The Soviet system, so reliant on overwhelming numbers and rigid top-down command, has no answer for this kind of battlefield creativity. Zveka Greengold, a single lieutenant in a single tank, is holding back an entire armored brigade, not just with his gun, but with his voice. He has become a ghost, a myth created in real time, and the Syrian advance, already shaken and demoralized, grinds to a halt, afraid to push forward into the darkness against a phantom force that exists only on the radio. In the chaotic fighting of the first few days, the Syrians finally achieve a small but priceless victory. They manage to disable and capture a single Israeli Sho't Kal tank. The vehicle is quickly dragged behind Syrian lines, a trophy to be studied and dissected. For Colonel Volkov, this is the moment he has been waiting for. The myths and battlefield rumors can now be replaced by the cold, hard reality of steel and engineering. He travels to the frontline depot where the tank is being held. He climbs onto its hull, the fine black basalt dust of the Golan rolling off the olive-drab paint. At first glance, the tank is unimpressive. It is a British Centurion from the 1950s, an old design, but the Israelis have modified it extensively. Volkov, a trained engineer, begins his autopsy not of a machine, but of an ideology. He starts with the engine. The Syrians pry open the engine deck, revealing not the original underpowered Rolls-Royce Meteor gasoline engine, but a powerful Continental APDS 1792A diesel engine, the same 900 horsepower workhorse used in the American M60 pattern. It is paired with an Allison automatic transmission. Volkov instantly understands the significance, and this is not a slow, lumbering relic. It is a nimble and reliable machine, capable of the quick pop-up attacks that have plagued the Syrian advance. It is a simple, pragmatic upgrade that prioritizes mobility and reliability over raw power. Next, he examines the optics. He is expecting to find some secret, advanced night vision technology to explain the phantom kills. He finds none. The gunner's station is equipped with simple, rugged M10 and M13 optical sights. There is no active infrared system, no complex starlight scope. The Israelis were not seeing in the dark with superior technology. They were simply better at using the darkness, aiming at the glowing IR beacons of the Syrian tanks. Volkov then climbs inside the turret, and it is here that the true, shocking revelation occurs. The interior is spacious. The turret ring is wide. The ammunition is stored cleanly and logically. A crewman can stand upright, move freely, and operate without the crippling fatigue that plagues the crews of the cramped, low-profile T-62. There are even small details that speak volumes: a built-in water boiler for tea, comfortable seating, and a logical layout of controls. The tank was designed around the human being. A Syrian engineer hands Volkov one of the Sho't Kal's projectiles, an armor-piercing, discarding sabot round. He holds it in his hand. It is dense, cold, a solid dart of tungsten. He instantly understands why the T-62s died in droves. His nation's own tanks relied on explosive heat rounds, but this was a different philosophy, a kinetic killer, a silver bullet that relied on pure, brutal velocity. Volkov looks around the spacious turret at the simple optics, the powerful but conventional engine, the deadly tungsten dart. It is a collection of pragmatic, intelligent, but fundamentally simple technologies. He turns to the Syrian engineer, a single, crucial question in his mind. "Where is the computer?" he asks, expecting to be shown a sophisticated ballistic computer that explains the tank's uncanny accuracy. The Syrian engineer looks at him, confused. "There is none, Colonel," he answers. "There is no computer, only people." That single line strikes Volkov with the force of a physical blow. Only people. It is the answer to the entire mystery. The Soviets had built a tank for a system, a machine designed to be operated by minimally trained conscripts in a massive, overwhelming wave. They had prioritized a low silhouette and a big gun above all else, and in doing so had created a cramped, inefficient, and exhausting machine that broke the men inside it. The Israelis, by contrast, had built a tank for the crew. They had prioritized ergonomics, endurance, and rate of fire. They had built a machine that allowed its human crew to remain effective, to stay alert, to fight longer and harder. This single, captured tank is an autopsy of the entire Soviet military philosophy. It reveals a fatal flaw in their thinking. They had focused on the steel, the numbers, the theoretical performance on a firing range. They had completely forgotten the human element. Volkov knows this realization must be the foundation of his report to Moscow. The Sho't Kal is not a superior tank because of a secret weapon. It is a SUPI. The morning of October 9th dawns cold and clear over a landscape of black, volcanic rock and burning steel. After 3 days of relentless, brutal fighting, the Israeli defense of the Golan Heights has reached its breaking point. In the crucial central sector, a single, battered Israeli armored brigade has been effectively annihilated. All that remains is a handful of tanks, 7, perhaps 9, operational vehicles, holding a final, desperate ridgeline. Their barrels are glowing red from constant firing, their ammunition bins are nearly empty, and their crews are on the verge of total physical and mental collapse. Opposing them is a still formidable force of Syrian armor, regrouping for what will surely be the final, decisive push. This is the moment the numbers which have favored the Syrians from the very beginning should finally overwhelm the last vestiges of Israeli resistance. In the command, Sho't Kal, Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani stands exposed in his turret, a deliberate act of defiance. His headset buzzes with the static of a failing network and the exhausted, frightened voices of his remaining commanders. He knows that his tiny force cannot possibly stop the next Syrian assault through firepower alone. Their only remaining weapon is deception. "We advance," he says over the radio, his voice calm and steady. betraying none of the cold fear he feels. They must believe that our reinforcements have arrived. A young officer in another tank, his voice trembling with exhaustion and disbelief, radios back. "Sir, we only have a few tanks, we cannot advance." Kahalani's reply is not a suggestion, it is a declaration of will that will become legend. Then they will have to believe we have a brigade. With that, the impossible happens. The 7 remaining Israeli tanks, instead of digging in for a final suicidal defense, start their engines and charge. They crest the ridge, not as a broken remnant, but as an organized, aggressive formation, their guns firing as they advance. For the Syrian tank commanders on the other side, this is an act that defies all military logic. They are exhausted, traumatized by 3 days of being slaughtered by phantom tanks. Their morale is shattered. They have been fighting ghosts in the dark, and now, in the clear light of day, they see what appears to be a fresh Israeli armored brigade charging directly at them. The dust clouds kicked up by the charging Sho't Kal tanks magnify their numbers, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The Syrian line, which had been preparing to deliver the final blow, hesitates. The hesitation turns to confusion, then to panic. The psychological damage from the previous days of fighting has been too great. They had convinced themselves they were on the verge of victory, that the Israeli line was broken. This sudden, aggressive charge shatters that belief. They assume that Israeli reinforcements have indeed arrived, that they have walked into a trap. The Syrian line does not just retreat, it collapses. Crews begin to abandon their tanks. Formations break apart as individual vehicles turn and flee, desperate to escape the charging brigade. The Israeli charge, an act of pure, audacious bluff, triggers a complete psychological rout. Kahalani and his handful of tanks press their advantage, firing their last few rounds into the fleeing Syrian armor, turning a desperate gamble into one of the most astonishing victories in the history of modern warfare. In the Damascus bunker, Colonel Volkov listens to the final, chaotic radio transmissions in stunned silence. He hears the screams of Syrian commanders ordering a retreat, the panicked reports of a massive Israeli counterattack. He looks at his own map, at the intelligence reports that show no significant Israeli reinforcements have reached the area. He understands what has happened. The Syrians have not been defeated by steel. They have been defeated by an idea planted in their minds by a handful of stubborn men in old tanks who simply refused to be broken. In the weeks following the ceasefire, Colonel Volkov returns to a cold grey Moscow. He carries with him not just notebooks filled with technical data, but a profound and disturbing understanding of why the war was lost. His final report, when it lands on the desks of the Soviet General Staff, is a strategic earthquake. It is a document that challenges the very foundations of their military philosophy. It is filled with heresies. The report begins not with an analysis of armor thickness or gun caliber, but with a concept that is almost alien to the Soviet engineering mindset: crew ergonomics. Volkov writes, with damning clarity, our T-62 tank is a superior machine on paper, but a torture chamber in practice. After 3 hours of combat, the Syrian crews were so physically and mentally exhausted that the theoretical performance of their vehicle became irrelevant. In the final analysis, crew ergonomics matter more than armor slope. This is a direct attack on the Soviet design philosophy that prioritized a low silhouette above all else, at the cost of human endurance. He continues with another heresy, this time aimed at their obsession with firepower. The T-62's 115mm gun is powerful, but its slow, manual loading process is a fatal flaw in a high-intensity battle. The Israeli crews, operating in a more spacious and efficient turret, could consistently fire 2 or 3 rounds for every one of ours. Rate of fire is more decisive than caliber. This simple observation undermines decades of Soviet focus on building bigger and bigger guns. Volkov's most scathing criticism is reserved for their night vision technology. The active infrared systems we have exported, and which are equipped on the majority of our own tanks, are not an advantage. They are a death sentence. In the dusty, smoky conditions of a real battlefield, activating the IR searchlight is the equivalent of lighting a beacon that says, "I am here, kill me." Active IR is fatal in dusty terrain. He recommends an immediate crash program to develop passive thermal imaging, a field where they are now a decade behind the West. Finally, he addresses the issue of command and control. He describes the Israeli hunter-killer dynamic, where the tank commander could independently scan for targets while the gunner was engaged. "Our commanders are blind," he writes. "They are passengers, relying entirely on the gunner's narrow field of view. To win the next war, the commander must have a hunter-killer override. He must be able to find the next target while the gunner is destroying the last." These insights, born from the bitter lessons of the Golan Heights, are not just technical suggestions. They are a repudiation of an entire way of war. They force a painful reckoning within the Soviet military-industrial complex. The development of the next generation of Soviet tanks, which had been proceeding along the same old philosophical lines, is thrown into turmoil. The insights from Volkov's report directly push the development of what will become the T-72 and the later T-80. The designers are forced to consider new priorities. They work to improve the hull geometry to allow for greater gun depression. They experiment with new, lower-signature infrared systems. They begin the long, difficult process of developing a more advanced fire control system and faster turret traverse mechanisms. The doctrinal empire, once so solid and monolithic, has begun to crack. The ghosts of the Golan, the phantom tanks, the pop-up attacks, the stubborn crews in their old British machines, will haunt the drawing boards of Soviet tank designers for the next 2 decades, as they desperately try to build a machine that can fight the last war, a war they had so confidently and so catastrophically already lost. Months later, long after the fighting has stopped, Colonel Volkov returns to the Golan Heights. The silence that has settled over the battlefield is different from the sacred quiet of Yom Kippur. This is the silence of a graveyard. He walks through the Valley of Tears, the site of some of the most intense fighting. The landscape is a scrapyard of his nation's military pride. The blackened, burned-out hulls of Syrian T-62s litter the valley, their turrets blown off or their guns pointing uselessly at the sky. He stops beside one of the wrecks. Lying in the black basalt dust next to it is something that has been overlooked by the salvage crews. It is a single, unexploded Israeli armor-piercing discarding sabot round, a solid dart of tungsten. He picks it up. It is heavy, cold, and brutally simple. It is not a complex missile. It is not a product of advanced electronics. It is just a very hard piece of metal, designed to be thrown at a very high speed. Holding the dart, looking at the silent, hulking wreck of the T-62, the entire cruel logic of the battle becomes clear to him. The Soviets had built a machine based on a set of theoretical advantages: a lower silhouette, a larger gun, the promise of night vision dominance. The Israelis had built a machine based on a single, pragmatic principle that the human crew was the most important component. They had sacrificed a low profile for a more spacious turret. They had chosen a smaller, faster-firing gun over a larger, slower one. They had prioritized gun depression, crew comfort, and reliability. Volkov realizes that his country had put its faith in steel, while the Israelis had put their faith in the men inside the steel. The Soviets had built a tank for a war of numbers. The Israelis had built a tank for a war of human endurance. He pulls out his notebook and writes a final, quiet postscript to his official report. a conclusion not meant for the generals but for himself. In the end, he writes, it was not about the steel, it was not about the numbers. Victory belonged to the crew that could stay human the longest. The final image of the battle is not one of fire and fury, but of a cold, quiet stillness. Across the Basalt Valley, dozens of Syrian T-62 turrets are scattered like discarded chess pieces. In the distance, a lone Israeli Sho't Kal, its engine still running, sits on a ridge, its turret turning slowly, methodically, as white smoke from a still smouldering wreck drifts into the cold wind. It is a silent testament to a battle won not by a superior machine, but by a superior understanding of the men who fight inside them. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a pivotal, yet often overlooked moment in modern history. If this story resonated with you, we would be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.